Hello. Welcome to the 4 o'clock session. Yeah, everyone, come on. Do you have energy? You need to stand up? Stand up for a second. Come on, stand up. Just stand up. Shake it out. The 4 o'clock session is going to be awesome. You're going to have the energy. We need a hat up here, by the way. We've learned this now being on the stage. This session is called Strategies to Reduce Climate Impacts for Oregon's Tourism Industry. And if you do need to stand up during the session, feel free. You can do that around the side, but we appreciate you coming a little closer and joining us. My name is Scott Bricker, and I'm the Interim Vice President of Destination Development at Travel Oregon. I'll be moderating this session, and I'll be introducing our 3 fantastic panelists in just a second. So Travel Oregon, as an agency formed under the Economic Development statutes in the Oregon Revised Statute, is an organization is what Eric Rebate last night called a triple bottom line approach agency. We're doing business, obviously, to support economic development and a strong economy through the traded sector industry that we call tourism. But we also care deeply about Oregonians, its people, its rich culture, and we're really working to create opportunities for visitors, Oregonians, and people from outside to have that interface and that exchange. And we want to make sure that we preserve that as well. And then finally, we absolutely know, and related to today's session, that we must steward and enhance our natural environment. Not only is outdoor recreation and scenic beauty the number 1 and number 2 reasons why people come and travel around the state, but it's just a critical aspect for all pieces of our daily life. And from tourism, we need to invest, and it's critical that we continue to ensure that Oregon is an amazing place. So climate change intersects and impacts all 3 of these areas. We know that there is a real threat to Oregon's unique and diverse beauty in the form of climate change, and we know that tourism emissions do relate to the climate crisis and contribute to it. So while climate change is impacting Oregon's tourism industry, I think we're compelled to take a deep look at how we can be on the forefront of solving our impact and fortifying our visitor experiences as well as our local livability to withstand this changing world. So again, this session convenes 3 fantastic leaders who are working to take an active role in programs and solutions to address climate change and its impacts. I'm going to briefly introduce them and then turn the floor over to them to have a fuller introduction to themselves and give us some presentations. After that, we will have a panel conversation and have an engaging one at that. So we'll be led off by Erica Sears, who many of you know and love as the Deputy Director of the Oregon Coast Visitors Association, which is a leading agency in Oregon on climate initiatives. Jillian Dimidio, shoot, I messed up. And actually, you're actually going last anyway. So I was like practicing Jillian's name. She's like, it's like Dimidio. But you're going last, so I will, but thank you for that opportunity to mess up in front of everyone on this recorded session. But Katie Warrobeck, who's a project manager at Synergy Enterprises, is actually going to be going second. And thank you for traveling from Canada and going through the border and everything to be here with us as an expert in this area. And then Katie, who I've already had the chance to botch your name more than once today, is a senior transportation electrification analyst at the Climate Office of the Oregon Department of Transportation. So we're really looking forward to hearing from all 3 of you. And Erica, why don't you come on up and take it away?
Sure. Okay, lots of gadgets up here. Uh-oh. There we go. Okay, thanks everyone. Thanks for joining us for this panel today. There are a lot of different ways we can present this information. There's at least 20 presentations we could give. How does this benefit your business? Why should you do this? How should you do this? How are DMOs doing this? And so sometimes it can be a challenging presentation to prepare for because there's so much content and so little time. So I'm excited today to share a little bit about the Oregon Coast Visitors Association, a little bit about the work that we've started doing over the past year, and then a few lessons that we've learned along the way, and still things that we're grappling with with, because this isn't a perfect process and nobody really has the answers yet. And so I think when we have opportunities as an industry to be together and be honest and transparent and say, hey, this is going really well, but this we're still working around, I think we'll get more solutions out of it. So to start with, out of curiosity, I'm wondering who's in the room. If you want to raise your hand, if you are a lodging business. Okay, great. If you are a restaurant business, couple. Okay, if you are a business, but you're not a restaurant or lodging. Okay, great. How about any destinations in the room or DMOs? Okay. Well, great. I think a lot of the information I'm going to share today is really going to be applicable to the destinations in the room, but I'm really happy to be joined by two other people that also have resources directly for businesses. So this slide has changed and is continuing to grow, and I believe at some point I will not have enough room on the slide. But a lot of times when we talk about climate action, it's like, oh, is OCFA, the Oregon Coast Visitors Association, are they the first nonprofit in the state of Oregon to work in this space? And we are not. We are not at all. There's actually quite a crowded space of industries that are already working in this space, and we consider all these different people on the slide to be our stakeholders. So just really briefly, we have the seafood industry. Obviously, that's one of our big products on the coast. Maybe you heard my executive director talk about it this morning at the morning session. So we had the oyster industry, due to ocean acidification in the early 2000s, had millions of larvae die off, and were unable to produce the amount of oysters that we usually are. So they were able to adapt to that and invest in technologies that create these different tanks so that they're able to continue producing at those levels. But again, they have essentially been working in climate action for the past 20 years almost. Commercial crabbing, we have a number of crabbers along the West Coast that got together and are suing the fossil fuel industry due to the impacts it's having on the Dungeness crab and the fact that their shells are too soft, that the seasons are changing so they're not able to have their usual production. And then fishing fleets. We have amazing fishing fleets on the Oregon coast. There was an incredible article that came out about the Newport fishing fleet last spring, that these guys that have been fishing since the 80s say that their number one concern is our changing climate and the impacts it's having on their seasonality, on what they're able to fish, and their ability to pay their employees. So we have the seafood industry already working in this space, already organizing and advocating and deciding how they want to invest in climate action for their industry. Then you have the dairy industry, semi-new to this space as well. The Darigold and Northwest Dairy Association have committed to carbon neutrality by 2050. They're organizing around this as an industry. They're advocating and investing in technology. Then you have our traditional tourism stakeholders. That's all of you in the room that we have in this wonderful tourism economy. And I mentioned this on my panel earlier today, that in our most recent stakeholder survey that goes out to all of Oregon, I was really surprised to see that we were prioritizing climate action in both the short term and long term for our region on the Oregon coast. And that data is available too for the rest of Oregon, but I'm all about the coast, so that's what I talk about. So we have all these different people and places and happening, and then when you look at us as a state, at the state of Oregon, we just approached the 2-year anniversary of an executive order that we have in Oregon for all state agencies have to have a climate action plan to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. And one of those agencies is ODOT, who will chat a little bit more about the resources. So you have all these agencies working in this space saying, okay, how do we reduce this? Oregon Department of Forestry has released their climate action plan. But where's tourism? We're just starting in this space and we're a little bit behind, but there's still a lot of opportunity. At a global scale for global tourism, there were different destinations around the world that were seeing the same impacts we saw during COVID-19. Supply chain disruptions, impacts to local economies, an inability to produce that local product. And so they got together and said, hey, at the end of the day, tourism is contributing to our changing climate, and our tourism destinations are being impacted by that changing climate. We need to do something. And they branded themselves as Tourism Declares a Climate Emergency. It's this initiative. It's free to join. Anybody can join if you're a business, if you're a destination, and start getting into that circle. And so we officially joined that initiative. That's how I met Katie when she was in her previous role with TODA. And yeah, so once a month we have a destination meeting. We are connecting with Visit Scotland, with Sweden, with the UK, with Palau, with Tahoe, and we're all getting together and having really honest conversations like, this is what's really challenging. This is what's a big win for us. Like Visit Valencia calculated the carbon footprint of tourism in their city, and they're among the first to do that. So this is really interesting community that we have together. So through that, at the last United Nations Climate Change Conference that happened in Glasgow in November, ACVA had a presence there, and we participated on an online panel, and we helped launch the Glasgow Declaration, essentially saying that all those same organizations signed this to say that, hey, the tourism industry wants to be a part of this, so that we can organize, so that we can advocate, so that we can invest in technologies, and that we're not just waiting to the last minute to be like, oh, we're impacted. Now we've never been in this space before. So there are 5 pathways that you are committing to when you're part of the Glasgow Declaration, or the Tourism Declares a Climate Emergency. You're committing to creating a 10-year action plan, and these are the 5 pieces of that plan. So if you're brand new to this idea or this topic, this gives you a little bit of a taste of what goes into those climate action plans. You have measure, to measure and disclose all travel and tourism-related emissions, and measurements need to be transparent and accessible. Decarbonize, set and deliver targets aligned with climate science to accelerate tourism's decarbonization. Regenerate, restore and protect ecosystems, supporting nature's ability to draw down carbon, as well as safeguarding biodiversity, food security, and water supply. Collaborate, share evidence of risks and solutions with all stakeholders and visitors. Work with others to ensure plans are as effective and coordinated as possible. And lastly, finance. Ensure organizational resources and capacity are sufficient to meet objectives set out in these climate plans. So it's big. You might be like, whew, I don't know where I would start with that either. But at least it starts giving you some of these components. And as destinations start standing forward and developing these plans, we can look and say, hey, actually, I'm very similar to Scotland in these ways. Let's copy part of their plans. And let me tell you, it's a very collaborative group. Sweden said, hey, we developed this carbon tool for visitors. Do you want it? So it's a really incredible community part of, and I feel like everyone's been really collaborative. So here are just a few key takeaways. This is just the most mind-blowing thing I came up with. I was really impressed with myself, ready to just present this internationally. And that was, I found out what my organization does, and I wrote it down on a piece of paper, and was like, whoa, this is mind-blowing. Because at the beginning of our climate action journey, we were like, wow, maybe the best way to do this is for us to go to all these businesses on the Oregon coast, help them calculate their carbon footprint, measure it year over year. And my partner, my climate scientist, and I were like, how would we ever do that? I have 4 full-time staff. I'm a nonprofit. Like, that's not doable. And we were like, well, what do we do? And so as a destination, and I'm sure other destinations in this room can relate to this, we have an internal operations, so how our staff operate, where we drive, our yearly budgeting cycles, we have control over that. Community partnerships, we work with other destination management organizations and chambers within our region. We provide tools and resources to them and to businesses. And then visitor support. I mean, as destinations, we provide information and tools for our visitors to plan and execute a wonderful trip on the Oregon coast. So I was like, whoa, I got it, I figured this out. And then Scotland was like giving a presentation. They were like, welcome to our 3 pathways: internal, community, and visitor support. I was like, well, at least I'm on the right path. So I would say if you're considering doing a climate action plan, one of your first steps is gonna say, what do we as an organization do? Maybe if you're a business, you do more internal operations. It's gonna be where the heat of your plan is, and visitor support. Destinations, we have this weird kind of gray area with community support. So that kind of combination will look different for all of us. And then here are some current actions, again, just analyzing what we do. This was so funny to me because, again, our climate scientist put this together. She's worked with us for a year now. And she wrote down what we already do. So we provide education, recommendation to businesses, standards and criteria. So if someone's on a food trail, they don't just get to join the food trail. There's usually criteria, a percentage of their food that's local. Impact reports, we do impact reports to understand what's going on in our region. We recently just did one about all of the Oregon coastal ports and their needs around tourism and infrastructure. Collaboration, of course, collaborating with partners and other DMOs in our region, and then creating innovation and new programs. And what was funny to me is that our climate scientists presented this to our executive director, but just said, like, here's actions that could be could be used for climate action? And he was like, I don't know, that sounds like a lot of work. And she was like, oh, this is what you already do. I was like, yes. And so looking at the actions that we already do and how could we include some climate friendly, some climate actions into these pathways that we already have. And then this is kind of a big struggle, and I just wanted to be really transparent about it, is I was just mentioning to Katie that every time I kind of present or talk about climate action, there are a number of recommendations from partners. So somebody might say, hey, you guys should focus on straws, only paper straws, no plastic. Someone also tell me, hey, you should provide to businesses what brand of dryer or washer they should use. A professor recently told me you should focus on keeping dogs on leash so they're not chasing seagulls because that's impacting our ecosystem. There are a million ways that we could be participating in climate action, but as a small organization with a small staff, we really need to be focused, and that's why we're developing this climate action plan to help kind of guide what direction we're gonna go in, and then deciding how do you prioritize what steps we take. We don't want our plan to rely on pet projects of our staff, and I want this plan to last even if I wasn't with OCFA in 5 years or 10 years. How do you make these plans live past the current employees and the passion projects that we often have? And so a few things that we've been looking at are, of course, the Glasgow Declaration, those 5 pathways I mentioned. What projects are shovel-ready? There are some shovel-ready projects out there, like how can we turn this fleet into EV vehicles? Plug. Which ones actually reduce CO2? Because we actually are trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, not just create, these like big campaigns just talking about friendly things. What is ecosystem resiliency? And then how many people will this action reach? So this is where we're at right now. It's really complicated. It's like this puzzle, and we keep putting together these different pieces, and it's looking better. The picture's getting clearer, but it's just moving around these different pieces in order to have a really impactful plan. And so this is my last slide. And I just wanted to say this is the biggest relief. I like to look at this slide, I like to share this slide with other people, is that your 10-year action plan or your climate action plan, it is not carved in stone. It is not set in stone. You can change it because right now there is so much technology developing. It might be difficult for us to calculate our carbon emissions as a destination right now, but it might not be in 2 years. And so it's kind of exciting to say, hey, let's start somewhere. Let's start working in this space, and then every year, every 2 years, we can revise it and say, hey, now we have more capacity. Now we have more expertise or money or technology to help us do this work. So I find this to be a big relief, this slide. And now I'm going to pass it over to Katie, I think is next. Yes, thank you.
Thanks, everyone, and thanks, Erica, for a great presentation. It's very nice to be back in the beautiful state of Oregon and to be at a conference again. And it feels good also to have climate action on the agenda front and center. So thank you very much to Travel Oregon for your leadership on this topic. So just a little bit about me as a more formal intro. My background is actually working with destination organizations at the provincial, regional, and local level. So I've worked with organizations like the Thompson Okanagan Tourism Association, with Travel Alberta, and Tourism Jasper. Also worked with the Adventure Travel Trade Association, and I've been on the front lines working with hotels, golf courses, and a small tour company. So I understand the challenges both for destination organizations and for tourism businesses. So I hope that gives you a little bit of insight into where I'm coming from. The company that I work for now, called Synergy Enterprises, is a corporate sustainability management firm based in British Columbia, Canada. And so Synergy was actually founded on the principle that businesses have the opportunity to impact global change and lead the world into a new age of environmental and social responsibility. So we specialize in carbon accounting, decarbonization strategies, clean technology, and regenerative tourism. And I'm also proud to say that Synergy has been a certified B Corp since 2016. So these are just a few of the tourism clients that Synergy's worked with. They're large and small tour operators, industry associations, destination organizations, conference centers. We also work with airports and marine ports around the world. And so we've measured the carbon footprint of huge global operators like the Travel Corporation, and we've also worked with small boutique hotels. All right, so now that we've got the intros out of the way, here's what I'm going to cover today. I'm going to walk you through a quick climate reality check, talk to you about tourism's carbon footprint, and then dive into taking action. Where do we even begin on this topic? And lastly, some emissions reduction strategies. All right, so climate reality check. Now this slide, you may have seen this before, but this comes from a website called Climate Action Tracker. And it's actually tracking different international governments' commitment to the Paris Agreement and where they're actually at in terms of that commitment. And so you can see that actually no one is on track to meet the target of 1.5 degrees Celsius. The US is sitting in insufficient, Canada is even worse. So we have some work to do. And I don't know if you've seen the latest report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, but essentially we have a limited window of time to secure a livable and sustainable future for all. Don't mean to be a downer, but we do need to make some changes in terms of how we operate our businesses, how we live our lives, in order to reset that relationship with our planet and create a system that benefits climate, nature, and people. Now, as we talk about some of the changes that our planet is experiencing, I want to point out that the cost of doing nothing is massive. And so one fact that I've come across is that for every 1 degree Celsius that the planet warms, we see 7% more moisture in the atmosphere. So just think of the disruption that 7% more moisture can bring to your business and to your community. It means more precipitation, extreme weather events, flooding. What does that mean if we go past 1 degree and it's 1.5, 2 degrees, or even higher? And climate change is already having an impact here in Oregon and on tourism. I don't know if you remember last summer, but there were devastating wildfires. We saw extreme heat. We had flooding in November 2021, and that's just the start of it. We've seen changing precipitation, reduced snowpack, drought, and so all of these present serious business risks to tourism. There's potential destruction of property from wildfires, flooding, and infrastructure damage. So really there's some serious risks to tourism. So what I want to share is that our window of time is rapidly closing, and we have less than 10 years to make a difference. So we need your help to make this happen. We need all hands on deck. So this is action at all levels, from the international level, through all levels of government, down to the business and individual level. All right, so that's the depressing part. On to a little bit more of what does this mean for tourism. So tourism is a huge global industry, as we know, and actually tourism represents 8% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So almost half of this is from transportation, while the remainder is accounted for in accommodation, shopping, food, and other emissions. So I've got a breakdown here that gives you a better sense of what are we actually talking about in terms of this footprint of tourism. So as I said, transportation is the bulk of it, but there's lots of other components within that, and I'll break those down a little bit further as we get into some case studies. If we know that transportation is the largest component, then we see that planes are actually at the top of the list, but cars are the next most CO2 per passenger mile. And then we see that trains, tour buses, and ferries are coming well behind. So something to think about when you're planning a trip for yourself as an individual, or when you're looking at how are you arranging travel for your guests. And I wanted to now bring it down to Oregon and understand a little bit about what we're facing here. So this chart shows past and present statewide emissions and the trajectory that Oregon needs to be on to reach its reduction goals, as well as the likely trajectory based on current trends and policies. The most important takeaway for you here is to understand where are Oregon's largest sources of emissions. So you can see that at the bottom, transportation is number one, and then electricity use is number two. And so these both align with key emission sources for tourism, as well as transportation and accommodations. And as you can see, with the 2035 goal, you need to be reducing emissions by over 50% to be able to get to that target within the next 13 years. So that means reducing over 2 tons per year over the next 13 years. So we need to be able to budget and plan and implement some significant changes in order to hit that. So I know this can all be a little bit overwhelming, but I want to give you some ideas here in terms of how can we actually get started on climate action. Whether you're a destination organization or a small business, there's definitely things that you can do to start taking action. So I like to think of climate action on a continuum. And in order to start on your journey, the first step is really to figure out what do we need to change. And so the way that we do that is measuring our impact and understanding what areas of your business or your organization are the highest emitters, and then that will start to point you in the direction of strategies that will have the highest impact for you. There's other steps along the continuum. I won't go into all those today, but really the starting point is getting that baseline understanding of what are my emission sources for my organization, and then setting some targets, engaging your team, and creating that plan to really start making some change. Right, so just to give you very high level, what is a carbon footprint when we talk about this? For an organization, it means looking at what are your business activities, such as natural gas, electricity, water, and then we take those and we multiply them by established emissions factors. So this gives us a measure of tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. All right, so not going to get too much into the details, but it really isn't as scary as it sounds. So we talk about emissions in terms of 3 different scopes, scope 1, 2, and 3, and these really depend on your organization's level of control. So the tricky part with tourism businesses is that most of the emissions tend to be in that scope 3, and this is where you have a little bit of control, but it's not directly controlled by your company. And so this is where it gets a little bit more difficult to define and measure, and you're looking at your suppliers and both the upstream and downstream relationships. But when we're looking at emission sources overall, you can think of them in terms of those fuels for heating, in terms of fuel for your vehicles or equipment. Looking at scope 2 is your purchased electricity, and then scope 3 is all of those other ones like waste, your water consumption, shipping, business travel. Employee commuting is another big one that falls into scope 3. All right, so to help you understand a little bit better at the business level, I wanted to walk you through a couple of sample carbon inventories, or GHG inventories, for some tourism businesses that Synergy's worked with. So the first one is a hotel in downtown Victoria, BC. They have 126 guest suites, meeting rooms, a pool and a gym, and 1 company vehicle. And so we've worked with Parkside for years to measure their footprint, and you can see that it comes out to about 476 tons of CO2 equivalent per year. And that may not mean much to you. It didn't mean much to me a year ago. But I find that it's helpful to understand what is that in terms of cars per year, or you can even look at it as an intensity metric in terms of kilograms of CO2e per room night or per guest. So once you have that understanding of what your footprint is, you can start to break that down into more meaningful metrics for your business. So that's just one example. The next one is another hotel in British Columbia. This one's called the Inn at Laurel Point. But what's different about this one here is that staff commuting actually comes out to be 54% of their footprint. And you may not think that staff commuting would be over half of their emissions, but that's their number one source, and then electricity is the second one. So I find that this is an interesting example because a lot of people think that emissions reduction strategies need to be facility upgrades and these big capital expenses, but it can just be something in terms of behavior change and looking at how are your staff getting to the property. My next example comes from the Adventure Travel Trade Association, and Synergy worked with them to measure the footprint of one of their adventure travel world summits. So this was an 800-person international conference hosted in Argentina. And you can see here that the flights make up almost 85% of the emissions for that 3-day conference, and the accommodation was the second highest source. So when we're talking about traveling to events, the flights are definitely the majority there. My last example is a whale watching tour company on Vancouver Island. And in this case, fuel use is 98.5% of their emissions. So they have a number of boats, they have some company vehicles, and then in this case, staff commuting is number 2, and business travel is number 3. So just a couple of examples to get a sense of businesses of different sizes and an event to look at where are those emissions, and once we know that, then you can understand what are the reduction opportunities. So where do we even start measuring? There's lots of tools out there. Some are free. One that I came across is through the Carbon Trust in the UK. They actually have a free tool for small and medium enterprises. It's a carbon footprint calculator. So you can start there. You don't have to spend any money just to get a sense of what are your emissions. You can also hire a company to help you, and that may facilitate the process and make it a little easier and faster if you don't have the internal capacity to do that. But for small businesses, you don't necessarily have to hire consultants to do this. You can start to understand what are some of those things that fall into scope 1, 2, and 3, and get an understanding. Other things that I've seen tourism businesses do is work with students. I actually saw a graduate student work with a winery in BC, and he did a whole thesis on what was the footprint of that winery and what were their emissions reductions. So it can be an opportunity to engage students or youth. And the last one is, if you don't want to go through the effort of putting everything into a calculator, you can just start looking at your electricity, your water consumption, and your waste diversion rate. These all feed into your scope 3 emissions. So even if you don't necessarily get that measure of tons of CO2 equivalent, you can still understand what are those sources. All right, so this is the fun part where we start to get into emissions reductions. And so I think the important part to note is that the measurement is really that first step to understand what activities are contributing to your carbon footprint as an organization, and how do we start to prioritize and determine where to invest our energy. So I've outlined here a couple of general strategies that would be applicable to most organizations. And I've broken these down into energy as the first one, and looking at things like switching to LED bulbs or switching to Energy Star certified equipment. Next one, we know that transportation is almost half of tourism's contribution to the carbon footprint. So thinking about what are some lower emissions options. Do you have safe bicycle parking at your location? Or do you have an EV charging station? Are there opportunities for car share in your community? If you're a tour operator, can you transition your fleet to electric vehicles? There's also opportunities in terms of reducing paper. How can you go tree-free? And maybe it's digitizing waivers or other office processes. Maybe it's increasing the post-consumer recycled percentage of the paper that you're using. There's even innovative products out there like Sugar Sheet, which is actually 100% tree-free paper from the residue waste of sugarcane. So we're coming up with all these cool things that this is paper that looks, performs, and recycles like traditional paper from trees, but it's made from sugarcane waste. So there's a lot of cool things coming out. That's one that I've come across. Other things in terms of waste, we know that waste is a big contributor. So how can you eliminate single-use items? How can you move to compostable or refillable packaging? How can you be shifting in terms of water to reduce the amount of water consumed by your property, whether that's low-flow taps or your toilets? And lastly, food is a huge contributor. So shifting to a more climate-friendly menu, whether that's locally sourced food, plant-rich, limiting red meat, and making sure that food is not traveling a huge distance to get to you. I've also outlined a couple of strategies that would be specific to hotels. And so one that I've come across is solar water heating for pools is always a good return on investment. The next one, staff commuting. And we saw the example where staff commuting was approximately half of their total footprint. So thinking about how are your staff getting to the property, maybe there's an opportunity to set up a carpool. Maybe there's an opportunity to have safe bike parking or shower facilities on site to encourage that behavior. Packaging and looking at your guest amenities or your cleaning products. Is there a way to source that product where you are able to have that product be refillable? And the last one is around procurement and thinking about how often are you ordering supplies or food? Can you reduce that frequency, which also reduces the transport required to deliver that to your property? So start thinking about all these pieces within your operation. I've also outlined a couple strategies specific for DMOs. And so DMOs are a bit of a unique organization within tourism because you don't really own the assets within tourism. You may help with the marketing or destination management, but you're not necessarily owning all of those pieces of the tourism experience. So the strategies are a little bit different. But with events and conferences, we saw the example of the ATTA event and looking at all of the food associated with that. Are you choosing a venue that's central to most of your attendees to limit the transport emissions? Business travel, I'm thinking that this will be one that will be returning in 2022 and beyond. And so looking at flights in particular, are you able to fly more direct and to limit the emissions through that? Are you able to extend your trip and have other meetings while in the destination? Also thinking about the itineraries that you're promoting to visitors and how are you encouraging people to move throughout your destination? Are you encouraging them to use electric vehicles and charge them at tourism assets? Are you encouraging travel, trade, and media to visit some of your more responsible and sustainable operators when they come to your destination? And the last one is around education and advocacy, because I think that DMOs have a unique role to play in terms of climate education, providing tools and training to operators, and advocating to tourism and non-tourism partners to bring them to the table and speak to government. So I'm not sure who has seen the book Drawdown, or if you have, congratulations. I think it's one of the most comprehensive guides out there in terms of reducing global warming. If you haven't come across this book, I highly recommend that you look it up. It's written by Paul Hawken, and it's really meticulously researched in terms of the 100 most substantive solutions to climate change that already exist. And so there's things that apply no matter what type of organization you represent. I wanted to highlight, just in terms of solutions, and within Drawdown and how they relate to tourism, the two that really stand out to me are around food. And so roughly a third of the world's food is never actually eaten, and actually Americans throw away more food than any other country in the world. So if we look at these as number 3 and number 4 solutions to climate change, I think that food is really one area that we can pay a lot more attention to, because the land and the resources that go into producing the food is part of it, and then the greenhouse gases emitted in terms of producing it and getting it to your property, and then in terms of the methane produced when it decomposes. So there's lots of opportunity to think about how food moves from farm to fork and where can we reduce those emissions. All right, so we know that we have limited time and budget, and we have all of these strategies out there to try to reduce our emissions, but how do we actually prioritize and how do we focus? And so what I would recommend in terms of focus is look for those opportunities or reduction strategies that are the highest return on investment in terms of your cost savings per dollar spent and your carbon reductions per dollar spent. You may want to do a sustainability assessment to identify what those opportunities are. We generally focus on water, energy, and waste within that type of assessment. You can also look at the relevancy, and do you need to upgrade any equipment in the next year or so? Can making any of these changes actually solve other pain points within your business? And will these initiatives enhance the guest experience or employee well-being? All right, so My final tips here for success are really to think big, but to start small. I think that we do need to think big about this topic since climate change is a global crisis and we don't have a lot of time, but don't let that overwhelm you. It's okay to get started wherever you are in your journey and start taking meaningful action. And I really like that Erica said, learn as you go. We're not all perfect. There is no perfect way to measure your emissions. There will be shortcomings in your data gathering process, and that's okay. I mean, you can adjust your footprint inventory over time and reflect those changes and those learnings, but really it's important to start somewhere. Don't stress about the perfect approach. And lastly, engage your team and celebrate your wins. This is a great opportunity to bring your team together and come up with some ideas and really to start moving together towards a solution. So thank you very much, and if you'd like to get in touch, there's my contact information, and happy to have a chat after the presentation as well. I'll turn it over to Jillian.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for sticking with us. We're now in the last 20 minutes of the last session of the day, so hopefully I can keep your attention here. My name is Jillian Dimidio. I'm a senior transportation electrification analyst. Let me advance the slides there. At the Oregon Department of Transportation in the Climate Office. And I just want to thank Travel Oregon and the other presenters. This has been a really interesting opportunity for me to step outside my lane a little bit. I obviously am not in the tourism industry, but I do think we can all agree that there's plenty of overlap between sustainable tourism and transportation. So I just want to give a quick introduction first into ODOT's Climate Office. We were established about 2 years ago through Governor Brown's Executive Order 2004. This was her sweeping executive order on climate change that directed 19 different state agencies to take immediate action to address climate change, not only in the work that we do, but also in our own operations. We're really proud to say that I think we're the only state DOT that has a climate office. And we really work hard to make sure that climate is ingrained in everything that we do as an agency and all of the decisions that we make. So we do this by work in 3 core areas. We have a mitigation program that's really focused on reducing greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector in Oregon, an adaptation program that's focused on planning for and adapting to extreme weather events and the impacts that those events will have on our transportation infrastructure. And then lastly, a sustainability program. So we're also looking at our own environmental footprint. We just recently completed a greenhouse gas inventory, and as part of that work, we have outlined strategies of ways that we can reduce our own greenhouse gas emissions in our own operations. So I obviously work in transportation electrification, which falls under our mitigation program. And actually, through our TE program, we play a leading role among state agencies in driving the electrification of the transportation sector. We are working hard to get more EVs on the road, and this is across all sectors, so cars, trucks, buses, and even electric bikes and electric scooters. And we do this primarily by focusing on increasing access to EV charging infrastructure. And the reason for this is that we know that EV charging infrastructure is what drives adoption of electric vehicles. So it's really our goal to make sure that EV charging infrastructure is as ubiquitous and as convenient as refueling your vehicle at a gasoline station today. So we do this work through a number of different program areas. We offer technical assistance, we do policy work, studies, and analysis. We do a lot of working with stakeholders within the industry across the state, but certainly most relevant to this audience is that we do a lot of work both supporting and also facilitating the deployment of that EV charging infrastructure in Oregon. So I do want to start with a little bit of context setting here and talk about why it's so important that we move to electric vehicles in Oregon. As has already been mentioned by both Katie and Erica, it's absolutely essential that we electrify the transportation sector if we want to meet any of our state climate goals. Transportation actually accounts for 40% of all of the greenhouse gas emissions in the state, and it's a similar story nationwide. And so with population continuing to rise and the amount that people drive increasing, we really do need to address the emissions from the transportation sector, and the best way to do that is to move towards electrification. But there are also a lot of other benefits to electric vehicles. As you all know, I'm sure these are zero emission vehicles, so they have no tailpipe emissions. And this can have a really big impact on local air quality and have some pretty big public health benefits as well. EVs are also cheaper to own and operate over time, and so can really go a long way to reducing the transportation burden for Oregon families. And then lastly, electricity as a fuel it's a local fuel and can have big benefits on the local economy. 70% of the money that we spend right now on extracting and refining oil that happens mostly out of state, that money is sent out of state. And so using electricity as a fuel has a really big potential for boosting local economies and creating green jobs. And Oregonians are increasingly recognizing the benefits of electric vehicles. We have had a little bit of a slow start. We have about 45,000 EVs in Oregon today, but 2021 was a huge year for EVs, and we saw a higher sale of EVs than ever before, and each month had higher sales than the previous month. You can see here in this chart that Oregon has a light-duty market share of EVs of 8%. This is higher than the national average of 4% and behind only California and Washington. And what this means basically is that 8% of all new vehicle purchases are electric vehicles. So EVs are here and more are coming. So I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about EV charging. This is our area of expertise within ODOT, and this is really where our focus lies. And you know, when you think about electric vehicles, it does require a little bit of a paradigm shift. It's a little bit different than gasoline vehicles because EV drivers have the option to charge multiple places. They can charge at home, and most EV drivers do charge at home. About 80% of all charging happens at home right now. But as we see electric vehicles increasing in adoption and becoming more mainstream, public charging and a public charging network is going to be increasingly important. So EV drivers also expect to be able to charge at work, at stop and shop type locations, so grocery and retail stores, tourist destinations, and for those of us who like to do long road trips, also on the road as well. So along our highly traveled corridors. And just to start with a little bit of an EV charging 101, I realize not everybody is steeped in this world, so we can do a little ground truthing here. There are 3 different types of EV charging: level 1, level 2, and then what we call DC fast chargers, which are sometimes referred to as level 3 chargers. And it's really the location of these chargers that's going to dictate what charger is most appropriate. So you can see level 1 chargers are going to give you your slowest rate of charge. It takes about 12 hours to charge an electric vehicle with a level 1 charger. And that makes home and anywhere that you can have overnight charging the most appropriate location for these level 1 chargers. The good news is that the cost to install and the complexity is actually very simple or low cost. Really all you need is access to a standard wall outlet and the EV charging cable that comes with your EV. Level 2 charger is going to give you a little bit of a faster rate of charge, takes about 4 to 6 hours, and that makes level 2 chargers most appropriate at those types of locations where people are going to be parked a little bit longer, but not necessarily overnight. So we look at level 2 for tourist destinations, for these stop and shop locations, for workplaces, and also for multi-unit dwelling locations. Still relatively easy to install and low cost, but you do need an electrician to install a level 2 charger. And then lastly, a DC fast charger is going to be your fastest rate of charge, taking about 20 to 30 minutes to charge an electric vehicle. And I will say this technology is advancing all the time. We're seeing higher and higher power levels of DC fast chargers, so that time is going to come down in the near future. But that makes these chargers most appropriate along our travel corridors. So this is more akin to your gas station experience. These chargers are very high cost to install and much more complex because they often require upgrades to utility service. So I want to talk a little bit about why I'm here to convince you all to consider installing EV charging at your business. We've talked a little bit about why it's good for the environment. We know that both tourism and transportation make up a significant amount of the greenhouse gas emissions in Oregon as well as globally. Apologies. And so it may seem like a really small thing to put an EV charger in your business, but it really does. We talked about how consumer confidence is so important when people are considering adopting an electric vehicle. So it really does go a long way in helping build that consumer confidence. And I do think the tourism industry has a role to play here because people want to know that they can travel in their EVs. It's also good for employees. We know that employees are increasingly seeking out green amenities, and this could be a really good way to set your business apart in what is an increasingly tight labor market. And then lastly, it's good for business. EV drivers, as I said, they're fully bought into this paradigm shift. They want to be able to charge everywhere they go, including on vacation, at where they shop, where they work, et cetera. And I'll say too that EV drivers are increasingly using apps to locate EV chargers on the road. So PlugShare, ChargeWay are good examples of that. Having an EV charger at your business could literally put your business on the map and help prospective customers locate you. So now switching gears, I want to talk about two programs that are run out of our office that are meant to support EV charging installations in Oregon. We have our community EV charging rebate program. This is a $4 million program to support installations of level 2 EV charging stations at those types of locations that I've talked about. So tourist destinations, stop and shop locations, but also workplaces and multi-unit dwellings. We expect this program to cover about 75% of the cost to purchase and install an EV charger. So it comes out to about $3,500 to $4,500 per plug. And we expect this program to launch this fall. It's currently in development right now. So I would say if you are a business and you are interested, please definitely stay tuned for the launch of this program. In addition, some of you may have heard that the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act has set aside quite a lot of money for EV charging infrastructure. And $52 million of this money will come to ODOT specifically to install fast chargers along our federally designated alternative fuel corridors. So right now in Oregon, we have 7 corridors that have been designated by the Federal Highway Administration, which are shown here on this map. We will very likely designate additional corridors, but this is what we have right now, and we know that we need to spend these dollars along these corridors. We're still in the process of sort of outlining our strategy for this program. We're still awaiting additional guidance from the federal government that really outlines the parameters of how we can spend the money. But we do know that we need to put these charging stations within 1 mile of these corridors. So I would say if you do have a business located along one of these corridors that is appropriate for a fast charger, this is another program that you're going to want to stay tuned and watch. And then lastly, there's so much information, and I had to really decide what to include in this presentation, but the best tip that I can give you if you are interested in installing an EV charger is to immediately reach out to your electric utility, not only because they want to be involved in that process as early as possible, but they also offer a ton of technical and engineering assistance, as well as many in Oregon also offer rebates and grants for equipment as well. This graphic here, I pulled from the Portland General Electric website. This is a really good example of the type of technical assistance that they offer, kind of walking you through every step that you need to do when you're thinking about planning, installing, and operating an EV charger. The last thing I'll say is that you can stack these incentives, so perfectly acceptable for you to take advantage of an incentive from your utility and take an advantage of an incentive from some of our incentive programs. So there are, again, tons of resources out there. I would encourage you to check the U.S. Department of Energy website or Clean Cities website. Oregon has some great websites as well. We have a goelectric.oregon.gov, which has a ton of great information on it. Also, orgoinelectric.com. So hopefully this is up long enough for folks to take pictures and get some of these websites down. And then lastly, just say, please feel free to reach out if there are additional questions, or if you just want to find out how you can sign up for our listserv and just stay involved in our programs. Thank you.
This is hot. Yeah, great. Well, thank you, panel, for an excellent presentation. And we wanted to provide you a couple different perspectives, a DMO perspective, and how the RDMO, the Oregon Coast Visitor Association, is getting involved, getting down to some real technical stuff, and also at the business level. And then we just thought transportation, because we knew that that was a big impact, and wanted to give that information to you all so you can potentially think about the connectivity there. So we only really have a couple minutes for questions. I'm just going to start off. I mean, one of the things that I took away was that I think that there's something we could all do as our individual business, or even in our personal behaviors, to shift that along. So I think that that's really interesting, just to think, even at the smallest scale, what could we do in our own organizations and our own businesses? But related to tourism specifically, so we heard a lot about the challenge and potential solutions and ways to get involved. How do visitors think about this? So we have people who are Oregonians or coming to Oregon. Do they care about climate? Are they looking for these kinds of opportunities? Is this something that, in addition to being the right thing to do and something that we can participate in, that's actually going to support Oregon as being a leader in the tourism ecosystem? Anyone want to have any thoughts on that?
Yes. I don't have the data right in front of me, but in my other presentation that I often give, we do have these stats from, I think it's called the Green Print Business Sustainability Report. It's recent, but essentially, yes, people are looking for those sustainable options when they're traveling. Consumers want that in the products that they're buying, the experiences that they're having, and it's over 70%, and you can break it down by generations and demographics. But then to accompany that statistic is that it's like 75% of Oregonians don't know what sustainable means. So I could say, like, I want to have a sustainable experience, and if it has like a green leaf on it, like, okay, is that sustainable? Great. And so that's an opportunity for us in the tourism industry to say, hey, what are those standards and criteria, so that if ACFA starts working on climate action and we're working in transportation, and then another DMO wants to work on it, that we're still working within the same criteria and standards, so that visitors could start seeing, yes, this is the Oregon sustainability brand for travel. I know that it's real, it's not greenwashing. So those are two stats I usually put together. Yeah, sure. Jump.
Yeah, just to add to that, something I came across also was in terms of Google and their Google Flight Search tool. I don't know if you've noticed recently that they've added the carbon emissions for different flight options, whether that's a direct flight or has different connections. And Google has actually seen some preliminary evidence that, yes, people are changing their behavior when they're booking flights because of that information being out there. So I think consumers are looking for more sustainable options. I've also seen research saying that consumers are willing to pay more for an experience where they know that the business has tried to reduce their environmental impact and they have tried to be more sustainable. So I think there definitely is strong consumer demand for this.
Yeah, I can just add a very specific transportation perspective. When you think about the early adopters of electric vehicles, these are definitely people that care about climate, and they care about the impact that their decisions is having on the climate. But broadening that a little bit, you can think of EV charging as an amenity that you're offering your customers and your employees. So I think definitely people are always wanting more amenities. Yes.
Thanks. I know we're really winding down. Maybe I'll just ask you, Jillian, really quick, around the formation of the electrification programs. I mean, is it just wait and see? Are there ways that the tourism industry should be thinking about getting involved at the local level, at the regional level? I mean, obviously, you could also talk about the state level, but because I think that there's a real potential connection there, and as more people get electric vehicles, obviously having charging stations kind of all over the place would make a lot of sense. Any just specific thoughts on that for us?
This is on. So yeah, I would say, to the same extent where the state is planning EV charging, every community is out there doing the same thing. So if you are a business located within a community, I would definitely get in touch with your local government and see what they're thinking about their planning for EV charging. In terms of staying up to date on our actions, we have a website. If you just Google Climate Office within ODOT, you can sign up for our listserv, and that's a really great way to just stay involved in upcoming programs. We're also going to be doing a whole lot of stakeholder engagement and public outreach with the private sector as well as public sector. So there will be a lot of opportunities for folks to share their thoughts.
Awesome, thank you. And I know that we are really out of time. And I know that also, Katie, you travel a long way, but you're going to be here tonight, right? Yeah. So if anyone has questions, anyone wants to chat up our panelists, we're willing to hang around for a bit, and we'd love to interface with you and have the conversation. We really appreciate you showing up. I know that there's another climate session tomorrow as well, so think about checking that out. Let's give a hand for our panel. Thank you so much. All right, well, we hope to talk with some of you, and everyone else, enjoy your Y-Guide experiences later tonight. Thank you.